COVID-19 impacts and this whole idea of returning to normal. And what does that mean, especially from a development perspective? And what I want to do at the very end is kind of take you through, you guys are all kind of development practitioners, experts, faculty who have a lot of experience in this and have thought deeply about it. I just kind of want to walk you through, but in order to set the stage, I kind of walk you through what is this normal people now think about when they say, oh, it's post-COVID, we need to return back to the normal. What is kind of the normal that people seem to be thinking about? And then also what is happening with both because of COVID-19, as well as some of the economic stimulus. And then we just have this kind of overarching issues of what we can do. So what I'm going to do now is to share my screen of my PowerPoint, and we kind of walk you through that. And as Lucia said, it would be good if you jot down your questions and then ask at towards the end. And also what I'd like to do is to request all of you to mute your speakers, okay? Microphones. So lovely. So now host is disabled attendee screen sharing. Now what do I do? Lucia? Your microphone is off.
You should just be able to click share screen. You cannot do that?
Nope, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Lucia, do you see a security icon at the bottom of your Zoom window?
Thank you, Nina.
That should give you the option to let him share.
Yes, I have share screen and I just now click multiple participants can share simultaneously.
Ah, lovely. Okay. PowerPoint.
Actually, Nina Miller is director of the MDP program at Regis University in Denver.
Hi, Nina. Do you guys now see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Are we still on? Lovely. So now, see, I'm from India and I speak fast. So if it becomes just too much of a blur, one of you should feel free to say, yo, kind of take it down a bit. You're just kind of whizzing by, right? So with that in mind, I'll kind of walk you through. So as I said, 3 sections. And now first, I want to kind of walk you through development in the pre-COVID-19, and especially as development practitioners, focuses on kind of both on 2 key issues. I'm not going to cover everything, but on 2 key issues, which one is rising inequality and what's happening. And then the other is, of course, climate change and broadly environmental kind of unsustainability. So one way to, and there is a lot of literature on inequality. Milanovic, Piketty, there are so many really, really excellent work has been done. UNDP's 2019 report on inequality is a really good one. If you guys haven't kind of used that, I would suggest immediately rushing out and kind of taking a look at that. So there is a lot of literature, but to kind of just to put it very simply, what is the share of global wealth? And this is wealth, not just income, it's income and assets. One way to put this is, imagine all of the global wealth as this bunch of oranges. You have 10 oranges, right? So how are the 10 oranges shared globally, right? You have whatever, 7.3 billion people. How is the global wealth shared? And lo and behold, this is using Alvarado et al., which is who they work very closely with Piketty and others. You basically have 99% of the planet sharing the 6 oranges, 60% of the wealth, with one cool dude amassing 40%. So this will kind of give you the stunning, if you equate these oranges to the trillions of the global wealth, then how you have 1% commanding 40% of the global wealth. Put it very, very simply, very simplistically, this is kind of the latest figure back from 2018. This, of course, comes as no surprise. And now if you actually parse how the top, not instead of the 1%, but the top 10% income shared across the world, you have across regions, really excellent work of the World Inequality Report. It really lists by regions. 3 regions historically have always had pretty high levels of inequality, and they're more or less same with some marginally kind of going down. And these are the Middle East, Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Historically, the top 10% have commanded more than 50, 55, 65% of the national kind of income. And then you have in other regions, and in some cases countries, that have seen dramatic they're going up. That means they're becoming more and more unequal, including kind of the US, and one of the more dramatic is India, and of course, Russia, especially post 1995. So this kind of gives you an idea of how the top 10% income shares across the world. And this is just to make a smaller point, which is important, that there is a lot of discussion on, oh, is this an aspect of globalization? Is this just a default? This is what happens when you have rampant globalization. And this one actually kind of makes a really good point to say, I know policies and institutions really matter. National policies, national institutions matter, and inequality is not somehow kind of mechanistic and somehow just as a deterministic consequences of globalization, as Piketty and others, and what I don't know, say, right? So, and now if you look at the other end of the spectrum, where do the poor live? This is from HDR 2019. You have under $1.9 a day of extreme poverty. You have 600 million people living below poverty. And of course, no surprise that in this graph that locates them by the HDI of the country, low human development, medium human development, high, and so on, that there is a large number of people living in low human development countries, with some countries almost 80% of the people live below the poverty line of $1.9 a day. That's the extreme poverty line. But then you see this kind of really big fat bubble in the middle, and that's my country from India. That's, even though it's a medium human in terms of development, it's medium human development, but a lot of people live below the poverty line. And with each bubble represents not only a country, but the bubble size is proportional to the country's population in income poverty. Again, this is not assets, this is income poverty. And again, I would urge you guys, if you haven't already, to go and look at HDR 2019. There's a lot of kind of very important and very interesting facts and laid out really well. This is to make a point. Too often people think that inequality exists only in the non-West. Inequality exists in former colonial countries. Inequality exists in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in parts of Latin America. Actually, no. And what is striking to me is digital inequality. Now, access to the World Wide Web it's such a fundamental aspect of one's own development that it is stunning to see digital inequality in Britain of a fairly high order of magnitude. Now we move to a very different aspect, which has been kind of gathering steam for a while, but this whole COVID-19 pandemic has really kind of accelerated and seems to have kind of in some sense decoupled or kind of broken from the past. And that has to do, especially in the US and possibly in some of the other, not all, but some of the other OECD countries, the link between the so-called kind of stock market and kind of main market. In this case, stock market as is derived in S&P 500 and its connections to unemployment levels. Historically, if you just kind of go back, in this case, just you go back the last 10 years, it was very tightly coupled, which means as unemployment went down, the S&P 500 went up, right? So there was a very tight coupling. This is what you kind of see. When the unemployment was 9.4%, which is very high back in 2010, the S&P was at 1,031. When the unemployment was at 4.4% earlier this year, the S&P was 2,500. But then what happened was pretty stunning. Unemployment shot up. For those of you who have been following kind of the US, news coming out of the US, unemployment shot up to almost 15%, and now it's kind of gone up even more. When this article came out, it was just under 15. Now it's around, I think, closer to 20. S&P shot up 2585. It's as though there has been a breaking of the link between unemployment and S&P 500. Another important one has been the growing decoupling and the divergence of what happens between returns to stocks and to wages. Here in this graph, you find, going back all the way to the early 1960s through 2019, the wages have been going up, but marginally, because this doesn't even include inflation in this graph. It has gone up less than 1,000%, 852% in terms of wages. But in terms of S&P 500, the rate of returns are 4 times that. So which means this makes a point, and David Harvey has kind of explained this really well in many of his kind of writings, is how more and more returns to capital outstrips returns to labor, and for a number of reasons, right? You have technology, you have outsourcing in this case, because it's kind of just focused on the US, it's not global, right? So many of these things going on, but fundamentally what you're having is less and less of, there is less and less sharing of kind of the global wealth that is being generated by this kind of amazing engine we call the global market. We come to another aspect that all of you are familiar as professionals of development practice and as theoreticians who have been kind of following development both in the global south and north. That is the spatial, economic, and kind of human inequalities. And characterized in this case, this is just an example of Mumbai, formerly called Bombay, right? And here you have in the foreground of this picture, you have this amazing kind of tight-knit cluster of slum and squatter settlement. In this case, I believe it's Dharavi, one of the largest in the world, with around almost 1 million people, depending on who counts, going between 700,000 to 1 million. And in the background, you have the amazing high-rises of Bombay, right? And what actually this signals to the observers and people who have studied this, it's not just a spatial manifestation of inequality, but also then it goes into many, many of the other things that you and I, all of us care about, which is healthcare and schools. The access to healthcare and schools for people living in the slums is vastly different. Of course, that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Clean drinking water and sanitation, hugely kind of different. Access to playgrounds, access to kind of security, privacy, and even fair policing. How you get treated in the foreground is fundamentally different if your address was in a different zip code of Mumbai. And what I want to make it clear is somehow Mumbai is not somehow this kind of unique. Oh, you need to say, oh, you need to fix Mumbai because there's such an outlier when it comes to rest of kind of urban development. Not at all, because this is characteristic of many of the cities, majority of the cities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, right? This kind of disparity. There are other kinds of disparities in the OECD countries in the global north, but this kind of disparities driven by, and the drivers are all much more contextual. In some countries, it's one of kind of rural despair. In others, it may be violence, environmental degradation, and in some cases also it's extreme patriarchy that is kind of driving families, that is driving women headed households into the urban areas, right, to make a living. And there is a larger point that I'll make later on. But the key is we are seeing more and more of this kind of inequality dimension, which gets smoothed over when people talk about averages. When people talk about, oh, the average per capita income of Rio de Janeiro or Lagos or Jakarta. No, always as practitioners of development, be wary when people talk about averages. You really need to question what is hiding behind those averages. Averages are good. It gives you a sense, but that's not the whole story. You really need to understand, because the averages in this case don't actually represent anyone's reality. So now that was a very, very quick overview on what people now looking back may have missed when they call things fondly as kind of the normal, the so-called normal. Now we kind of really quickly move on to kind of climate change and environmental so-called unsustainability. It's clear to all of us, and I'm sure you guys have done kind of extensive studies of this, that we are basically blowing past this climate optimum of the Holocene kind of temperature variation of the entire for the last 12,000 years, which humanity saw the emergence of agriculture and all forms of its intensification, human settlements, and all of the complex societies that you and I now live in and participate in globally. All of this emerged in the blink of a geological eye, which is less than 12,000 years. And that was based on what's now called kind of the climate optimum. And now we are kind of blowing right past that. The last 5 of the 10 hottest years globally have been in the last 5. And 2016 was the hottest also, remember, it was also because it was the El Nino year. 2019 is the second hottest, and it was not an El Nino year, but still it's hottest. And I'm sure where things are going, 2020 again is going to be another super hot year. Summer temperatures, and this is an anomaly. See, this one gives the anomalous summer temperatures in parts of Western Europe and kind of Scandinavia and parts of the UK. Last year saw this kind of amazing anomaly of +5 to 9 degrees centigrade. Is the anomaly from the kind of the averages. Again, unheard of anomalous situation in terms of temperature. We've just had a severe cyclone hit parts of India and Bangladesh a couple of days ago, Amphan, and there are more to come. Just a very interesting article just came out in PNAS, how there is a global increase in major tropical cyclone exceedance, had probability over the last 4 decades. And in other words, Washington Post put it very simply, that the strongest and the most dangerous hurricanes are now far more likely because of climate change. This was always a point of research, or always a kind of a bone of contention when people said, well, is climate change going to strengthen hurricanes? Is it going to give more frequent hurricanes, or depending on which part of the world you come from, typhoons, cyclones, right? And now there seems to be a really good amount of research that has shown that now they're going to be far more dangerous hurricanes. There are far more kind of stronger hurricanes are more likely because of kind of climate change. And we know most of the climate change that we're experiencing is anthropogenic climate change, human-induced. So again, to make it obvious to all of you, we just saw in April 2020, with the data released just a few days ago, the CO2 concentration, global atmospheric CO2 concentration in Mauna Loa with a whopper is almost 416.18 parts per million, right? And it was just in 2013 that we went past, historically first ever, went past the 400 ppm, and now we're already at 416 ppm. And humanity hasn't been kind of sitting quietly. We have been doing a lot. Many of you may have been to COPs. Many of you may be, in fact, be working in environmental ministries, forestry ministries, and industries, and so on, who really kind of striving to do the right thing. 2015, some of you may have attended the Paris, the COP in Paris, the Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, and that was a historic one because the 193 plus countries adopted formally the Paris Climate Agreement, right? Which basically required emission reductions. Again, it's not legally binding, and we can go into a whole lot of this stuff, but it is not a legally binding kind of document, legally in the sense you cannot kind of tell a country, hey, you signed this, you haven't done it, so we want to take you to court. No, it's voluntary, right? But even that now seems to be on life support. Current policy trajectories, we seem to be well on the rise to 3 to 4 degrees centigrade, which is really alarming. Even the 2 degrees centigrade consistent policies now seem to be hard pressed, let alone the aspirational 1.5 degrees, because a lot of the small island development states, a lot of the vulnerable and marginal areas, coastal areas around the world, for them, this is a matter of life and death. This is not just some academic discussion between, oh, what's the big difference between 2 degrees and 1.5? Because the nature of kind of the physical manifestation that will come out because of these kind of global warming is enormous, right? Now it seems to be, in fact, to get at even the Paris Climate Agreements rather, because a lot of people were unhappy at Paris Climate Agreement, saying it was just simply didn't go far enough. But even the 2 degree now, it seems to be that we have now well on the way to overshoots. This is this is basically a combination of 4 illustrative models of the IPCC. And what it shows is all the models now show that humanity is going to overshoot. And hence what we need to do is, in order to kind of have the decline that is needed, you really need to kind of go into carbon sinks. And that may not be the best of all possible worlds, because a lot of the technology of carbon sinks, other than photosynthesis, forestry, land use management, is simply not scaled up yet. It's more than proof of concept. Still, we're nowhere close to having that. So to have our entire kind of humanity's future tied to such uncertainty, and there are lots of issues of governance and kind of social acceptance and so on. So that raises, again, what is it that we have been doing in the normal that has now led us to this impasse? just a series of quick slides when people talk about climate injustice. As practitioners, I want you to be alert to the fact that there are many kinds of injustices with many axes and many protagonists, right? So it's not just global north versus south, or people of color versus the people, the whites, or it's the rich, the elites versus the poor, or the capitalists versus, I don't know who the opposite of capitalists now are, what, plebeians, subalterns, I don't know, depending on which theoretical foundations you have, right? But it's now really kind of getting messed up because it's important to kind of actually understand, depending on where you work, there are many kinds of injustices. As we can just, I'm just going to stop talking and just kind of walk you through the next 4 or 5 slides. Okay, so there are many kinds of injustices. For some of you may have taken a class with him, or definitely may have read many of his articles. The gentleman with the hat who's getting arrested in New York is our colleague from Columbia University, Jim Hansen. So there are many kinds of climate injustices, and people are kind of fighting for different kinds. And so it's important to keep in mind that there is not just one simple way to say, oh, down with X, down with Y, because there are many, given where you are, your context of practice. You really need to be careful about the axes of injustice to make sure you don't kind of repeat some of the mistakes that's been done so far. And climate change, unfortunately, is not the only large-scale kind of global threat humanity is facing. Another massive threat, all of you know, is the 6th mass extinction. It's called the 6th because we have had 5 before the Holocene period, which I discussed extensively in my class, but we don't have time for that. So, but the 6th mass extinction, and what you see very kind of really sad to see is how it's across all of the kind of the IUCN categories, all the way from kind of fish, all the way through plant life, to all of them are now under kind of different extinction risks threats, right? And see, you need to be aware that IUCN's red list has several categories, with the critically endangered just before the extinction, then you have the endangered, vulnerable, and so on. And the question is why? The why is, again, humanity. Thanks to our both curiosity and our endless thirst for resources, and our kind of almost, it looks like impossible to satisfy not our needs, but our wants. There's a fundamental difference between what a person needs and what a person wants, right? The key drivers of species loss are all because of kind of humanity-related human activities, right? And for example, the key drivers of loss are like 5 of them: and habitat degradation, invasive species and disease, pollution, all different kinds of pollution, air, water, and so on. Climate change is a big threat, and exploitation, right? And depending on the kind of the type of species, they have the drivers of loss play out differently. So what you have is birds, reptiles, mammals, and fish. All of them are threatened by these kind of key drivers of loss. So what I'll do is at the end, I'll share this PowerPoint with Lucia, and then she can kind of send it around to you guys if there is interest, so that so that you can guys can observe some of this more closely. Then, you know, of course, the fine work of Rockstrom and colleagues on Planetary Boundaries back from 2009. They have kind of reworked it down to the regional level. And basically, you have these kind of 9 planetary boundaries. Data suggests that we have already kind of gone past these safety thresholds for several of them. And a couple of them now are kind of coming down, coming close to the horizon of kind of going past the threshold. And one thing I want to keep in mind is not just that they have specific boundaries being crossed, but also they have certain tipping points, and they have non-linear systems. They can actually set off a cascades of other unexpected changes across some of these kind of boundaries, right? So what I find very interesting in when you talk to even the knowledgeable people, even the people who kind of read and who are thoughtful, is our ability to be shocked by what we call as the normal, because people like you and I, researchers, scientists, analysts, writers, teachers, reporters, and practitioners have been informing in the state of societies, for example, in this, how unequal societies are becoming, and on the sorry state of environment, on degradation, on global threats, local threats, regional threats, right? For decades now. This shouldn't come as a surprise, okay? Because I've been through research, analysis, writing, teaching, reporting, and ground kind of well-informed practice. We've been kind of telling this to the world. But again, it's really interesting that it seems to become as kind of a shock to the system. Oh, really? I didn't really think it was that bad. I really need to change my behavior collectively, human behavior. Oh, I didn't really know, right? So that's another whole interesting kind of psychological and social behavioral issues, which I think as development practitioners, we need to be much more kind of mindful of. When we talk about creating evidence for policy, what's the nature of evidence? We have been so far just focusing on the evidence rather than kind of saying, okay, how come we have more than ever historically, we have mountains of evidence, and yet so little of it seems to be relevant for practice, gets used or used selectively. So anyway, so that's a pet peeve of mine. I'm kind of writing a book on that, but that's a pet peeve, which is kind of, I find really kind of interesting. So now what we'll do is, I better rush. Section 2 is a slightly longer one, and the section 3 is kind of very short, right? Stimulus packages. I just want to kind of examine in kind of 3 locations what's happened in COVID. What has COVID-19 unveiled? Singapore has been, until recently, was a case study on how to do it rightly, how to kind of go about kind of containing the pandemic. And they did a brilliant job till kind of earlier part of May. And then they did a really good job. There were 0 cases. And then suddenly, again, things all kind of broke loose. And people are wondering what the heck happened in Singapore. And it turns out that even those cases in April, and then in May, the vast majority of cases were in what called migrant dormitories, where you have the low-income workers who really keep the engine of Singapore kind of together and going. That's where most of the 95% of the cases were in the migrant dormitories, and the rest spread across. And if you actually, there are a lot of interesting literature on ethnicity of people who have gotten COVID-19 in Singapore. And again, it's all about low-income migrant communities that are getting this, right? And you ask why? It's not a surprise, kind of really crowded living conditions. In this case, they've done being Singapore, they've done a really, really neat job. You have 20 people in this very small, tidy room, but really jam-packed together. There is no such thing as social distancing is possible, right? And what I want to draw attention to is the underlying dominant logic. It's not just in Singapore. The underlying dominant logic is of a servicing urban underclass, right? The servicing urban underclass, whether it's Moscow, Paris, Phnom Penh, Cape Town, any of the cities you come from, you live in, or you visited, behind the billboards, you will find the urban underclass, which are such an important part of the urban economy. And they are, because of inequities in public health, access to public health, and underlying health conditions brought about by poverty and other causes, they're the first ones to kind of fall under, in this case, the pandemic bus, right? So this is, again, not unique to Singapore. This is what's happening in most parts of the world. India put the entire country, the government of India put it under lockdown, and for all the right reasons. The way it was done begs the question, it should have been done better, but let's not kind of go into that. But what really happened was you had millions of people who were the economic migrants stuck in cities who wanted to kind of go back to the villages, right? Again, you had tens of millions walking because government of India quite rightly had closed trains, buses, all forms of transportation, public and private, right? So these people just took to the streets, and then they were asked not to go. Some cases they were beaten up, right? It's very sad and shocking, which shocked the nation. And then there was a massive release of operation was swung into play, and all for the good. But again, what I want you to kind of focus on is the kind of the dominant logic. There is a dominant economic logic around the world that says that has resulted in labor displacement. Millions of people moving about in countries or across to neighboring countries or across parts of the world. and they are dispatched into kind of unfamiliar cultures, ecology, and ways of life, right? So they're kind of, in some sense, economically kind of, for economic reasons, they're kind of uprooted, and it's not an accident. This is part of the dominant kind of economic logic of the time we call pre-COVID or the normal. Again, come back to Dharavi just to make a point that now we have around a million people, smaller than, for those of you who know New York City Central Park, much smaller than New York City Central Park, 2.1 square kilometers is the size of Dharavi. And out of that, almost a million, have 125,000 slum dwellers under lockdown with drones, making sure they don't go out of the houses, right? Because there are hotspot clusters of kind of COVID-19, right? And now there's a very, very low amount of kind of testing that's kind of gone on. And this is repeated over and over again, is being repeated in other parts of the world. Again, these are part of the urban underclass, and they are kind of being kind of impacted in a very big way. Now, coming to New York City, you have the poor in New York City. As I said, poverty is not a stranger to New York City. Maybe it's a bit of a stranger to the borough of Manhattan. A lot of people mistake when they say New York, they think, 42nd Times Square. If they come to Columbia University, oh wow, fabulous buildings. But that's just one borough. That's the borough of Manhattan, which I have in this blue dotted line. Then you have the other boroughs. And what is important to notice is that this one talks about the percentage of people living in poverty. Manhattan has amongst the least 0 to 20% of people, poor people live there. The vast majority live up in the Bronx and in parts of Queens and Brooklyn. And you find when it comes to the spatial geography of COVID-19, again, it repeats the same obvious thing, where you have high dominance of poor, and in this case also kind of different races and ethnicities. There is a large scale kind of impact of COVID-19. The same when it comes to COVID, not just the cases, but death rates, actually death counts, okay? And so you have now really important data kind of coming out about the skewed nature of mortality by race, ethnicity, age, and employment, right? And again, this phenomena is not going to be unique to New York City. It's going to be in many, many other parts of the world, how there seems to be kind of a dual tracking of kind of asset inequality, access to resources, access to public healthcare, access to education, all of that impacting COVID-19, both the cases as well as death counts. Here, an interesting one about the spatial distribution of hospitals and COVID-19 cases. What I want to do is just to draw your attention that these columns are by boroughs, and how there is a huge disparity between the number of hospital beds available and the number of COVID cases. And the hospital beds in the boroughs of New York are not based on population estimates. That's why I kind of made sure I have it on the bottom of the screen. I put the 2019 population. They are again a function of wealth, of the need to have healthcare, right? Of the middle income, upper middle income people. And so Manhattan, for example, look at the blue column in Manhattan. Blue column is private beds in Manhattan, which vastly is far more than the availability in the other boroughs. So the question is, what gives? Why this level of kind of inequality now? It's kind of coming, this is not news to researchers. Should not be news to any of us, right? But again, the general public is sitting up and saying, whoa, we didn't realize this kind of inequality existed. And in an everyday kind of development sense. There is a really interesting article just came out, research paper came out of Wider, which basically said that COVID-19 may end up pushing 500. This is their headline grabbing, which is the most worst case scenario is 500 million people around the world globally may be pushed into poverty. And it is shocking. And for those of you interested in this, you should go through this paper. They have 3 kinds of scenarios of contractions, of a 5% contraction in GDP of these countries, of these regions, 10%, 20%. And they have for different poverty line estimates, extreme poverty line of 1.9. Then for middle income countries, $3.2 a day. And for high income countries, they have 5.5. But across the board, they say COVID-19 is actually going to be pushing large numbers hundreds of millions of people into poverty. And this is extremely disconcerting, because if there is one thing that humanity has done well, is make the numbers in extreme poverty go down dramatically. And a lot of it was to do with China, which in the last 40 to 50 years has dramatically pulled 300 million out of poverty. Again, India has pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty, right? And sub-Saharan Africa, many of the parts of the world have done amazingly well. But now it looks like there is going to be a massive, it's going to be in the blink of an eye, you're going to have large-scale kind of extremes of poverty blooming in across the board in many of these countries. Now we come to the last thing here is economic stimulus. Understanding the normal, understanding the way COVID-19 is accelerating this inequality. One would hope that economic stimulus takes this into account, right? I would, you would, right? And there has been amazing amounts of money have been kind of dished out. Japan has just a mind-boggling 21% of the national GDP is various aspects of this fiscal stimulus. The US is just astounding, 11%, and it goes down the way. All countries have done kind of remarkable. Despite the economic orthodoxy that you hear when you talk about climate change, oh, no, we need to be mindful of the debt. We can't really be spending this into the future, da. All that seems to be now kind of gone, right? Oh, there is some writing here coming. I don't know how that's happening. That's interesting. Okay, so the US economic stimulus package has three components. Immediate fiscal impulse, which is almost close to 2 billion. That's 9% of the GDP. Deferrals, which is around just over 500 billion, and other liquidity guarantee measures, another 500 billion, right? So these three together have now, as this is of April 23rd, and now more is coming down the pike. There is a lot more. The Congress is kind of looking at a lot more. And a lot of observers have said, yes, this is very good, but we actually need to do more. And many of them have said, while a lot of it is done in the right way, but if you actually look at the fine print, it is alarming that there seems to be kind of a giveaway to certain people, to certain companies, and which has been captured by this Rolling Stone. I thought this is a brilliant Rolling Stone article, which will be coming out in early June, which is captured by this about how it's going to be benefiting the rich. And there is another interesting research that has just come out by these folks, all from the kind of the IMF. They look at pandemics and inequality. What have the last pandemics in this century? We're not looking at the Spanish flu. We're not looking at kind of 19th or 18th century. It's very hard to make kind of common cause economically. But just in this century, SARS, H1N1, MERS, Ebola, Zika. After the pandemic, what happened to inequality? And it's really, really disturbing to find out that it has actually raised income inequality. It has lowered the share of incomes going to the bottom of the deciles, and has lowered the employment to population ratio for those with basic education. That means did not impact as much with those with advanced degrees, but those with basic education, it really lowered their employment potential, right? And there is some kind of interesting work they've done. It's basically to show how pandemics lead to a persistent and significant increase in the net Gini measurement of inequality. And separately, they cite, but separately also the US Congress Joint Committee of Taxation has done an early assessment of its own government programs to combat COVID-19, which suggests that the rich are likely the major beneficiaries of the economic stimulus. So in light of all of this, what we're having is actually already the beginnings of a kind of a chorus of people kind of saying, especially in parts of the world, for example, in Europe, a big deal was European Green Deal to have climate neutrality for Europe by 2050, right? Now countries are calling in and companies are kind of quietly murmuring, saying, yeah, we need to jettison that. We need to hasten a return to normal, economic normal, social normal. Let's forget about the green part of the European Green Deal. Same thing, many countries are saying, let's forget about Paris Climate Agreement. And some of them are going to say, look, Agenda 2030. And who are these people? Well, generally powerful interests. Then leaders who depend on powerful interests. And many of us come from countries that we know of these folks. Leaders who don't like to take on powerful interests. Then, of course, you have communities in ignorance. If those of you who know Gavanta's excellent work on the Appalachian, you should read How the Three Faces of Power. He does a brilliant job about looking at why people don't act in their own self-interest, right? And then communities across the world that aspire for good life, for Western kind of lifestyle. Why not us? It's time that why should we be the ones giving up our future? And also communities that are barely making do in the right in the now. And the refrain is kind of constant. It is, oh, going green is going to cost jobs, so let's not go there. Oh, the Greens, environmentalists hate the poor. They're against. They're all these elites. Climate change is a hoax. Green is a plot. They don't want us to prosper. Too costly. And finally, now is not the time. We agree, we need to do this, but sorry, now is not the time. We need to go back to the normal, right? So post-COVID-19, the last part is very short. When we talk about return to normal, what the heck are we talking about? What normal? We just examined the inequality, the nature of deep nature of inequality, as well as kind of environmental kind of catastrophe that's kind of around the corner from us. What normal, right? It was not a normal in that sense at all that we all should be going back to. Because the pandemic has revealed deep and systematic problems. One is within economic relations and the structuring of power that has benefited the few. It depends on a certain kind of valuation of nature that ends up destroying nature. And we also realize how the precarious, as I said, the precarious trait, the uncertainty, the ephemeral nature of social contract between the states and citizens. Those of you who have studied political science understand the importance of kind of social contracts. It's a deep and abiding faith in the system that the system is not going to let you down. And we have that complete kind of, in many countries around the world, the social contract simply doesn't exist, right? So it's not kind of tweaking around, returning to building resiliency, being prepared for the next pandemic that as development practitioners, we need to be kind of aiming for. I think we need to aim for something kind of quite different. We realize that the fundamental changes are required to advance. We need to keep foremost protection of the vulnerable, the poor and the marginal. Economic relations need to be in the service of people. Other people have written brilliantly, Schumacher and others have written kind of really brilliantly about the economic relations. It should be in the service of people and not the other way around, David Sears and others. Market interactions that need to sustain nature and not kind of deplete nature and end up kind of destroying nature, right? These are the fundamental changes that are needed in order to kind of in this kind of post-COVID and not a return to the old normal. And as MDPs, you know development better than anyone else, right? You know the development is not about maximizing economic growth. You know it is about realizing human potential and expanding freedoms in the concept of Sen and others. And the freedom of people is both a means and an end. It's not one or the other. It's not saying, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources, democracy is too costly an experiment, all the ones that you hear. No, freedom is both a means and an end. And it's very clear that market doesn't care for social ties or environmental health. It needs to be guided, it needs to be regulated, right? So market doesn't care in it by itself, right? So leave it to the market used to be a mantra. For those of you as old as me, and I worked in the World Bank for a couple of years, a long time ago, leave it to the market used to be the big mantra. And we know that's a sure path to inequality. Now, more and more research has shown it's a massive weight for more inequality because it's not the fault of the market. Poor aren't consumers in the market, so they don't exist as far as the market goes. And another mantra was getting the price right. Get the price right. Stupid or some such thing used to be these kind of stickers in the 80s, 90s, right? We know it leads to planetary disaster. There is no such thing as a sustainable economic growth. That's an oxymoron when some economists talk about sustainable economic growth because the factor is growth, not sustainable economies. Growth. How can you have growth in a finite planet with infinite wants? Because that's the whole issue of growth, right? So as MDPs, you must understand that sustainable development is not a win-win. On most issues, most of the time, there is too much of this, sustainable development is a win-win and everyone will hold hands and kind of, dancing to nirvana, right? Sorry to say, there may be a few win-wins. Mostly it's win-lose. There'll be winners and losers. So you need to organize the development practitioners as thinkers of development. What are the trade-offs that are critical between interests and societies, between nature and people, right? The trade-offs. It's not just, oh, everyone's going to win. No, unfortunately, that doesn't happen too often. And of course, the winners strategize and organize to keep winning. They're not going to say, oh, yeah, sure, but I'm kind of really tired of winning. I'm going to give up my wealth and go retire to a forest, right? No, the whole idea is intergenerational wealth transfer, all of that. They keep strategizing and organizing to keep winning. And there is also a great deal of fixation with technology. Oh, if we only had the next technology, somehow it will fix poverty. It will create green jobs. Renewable energy will become so, sure, technology has a role, definitely, but lasting change is not just a technology fix. Because this I come to the very last part, development inherently is political. Doesn't mean all of you need to jump into formal politics. Yes, maybe, but maybe not, right? What I mean by political is, as development practitioners, you need to understand how power is exercised, how it was exercised in the pre-COVID era, how power is exercised in your town, in your country, between the private sectors, between the dominant and the dominated, right? Is exercised because these are exercised through institutions, right? And how injustice is justified in the name of economic growth, in the name of, oh, in the long run, blah, 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 revenue generation, all this stuff, right? Always in your work, ask, who is paying the cost? Someone is paying the cost. Who is paying the cost? Is it environment? Is it nature? Is it the vulnerable people? That's where you need to kind of come down hard. And of course, embrace judiciously technology and the market, but as means to an end, not valorizing them as an end, as kind of somehow public good in themselves. Technology for the sake of technology, or for the market for the sake of market, right? They are just a means to human development. And most important is subjecting your passion to advancing the public good. And depending on your work, where you work, public good can be defined, redefined, right? And you need to kind of keep thinking about that, but both with humility and reflexivity, right? It shouldn't be the sense that, oh, I'm so passionate about whatever, having biogas. And if you don't agree with that, somehow you must be bad. This whole idea of cancel culture. No, with humility and reflexivity, you really need to understand the development is political and how you need to strategize in your own work. So that's the end of my talk. I think it went way past 30 minutes. Really sorry, guys. And I leave this with Lucia for her to send it around. And at the very end, I'm not going to go through this. This is just for those. Many times when I speak, people have asked, could you share some interesting stuff, interesting books, both recent and old? And this is just for you students, for you to kind of get a better sense of the scope of development, scope of sustainable development, some of the historic narratives and so on. And it's a very broad brush, right? So with that, Lucia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shiv. Really, really very interesting and stimulating. I know there are a few questions, so please, everyone, if you have a question, please go down to participants, the icon participants, click on your name and your hand icon will come up. So the first question goes to Uanisa, and please make your question short because I want to get maybe 2 or 3 questions before we end. Uanisa, over to you. What is your question?
Okay, let me. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Get closer to the mic, please.
Okay. I have 2 questions. I want to the prof there to break it down for me. What is the relationship between COVID-19 and the weather? It seems like the cold weather climate, the people are suffering more than the drier environments. Is there a relationship there? That's one. The second one is social welfare policies by governments. I'm wondering whether do the social welfare policies by most governments enough or effective or appropriate or resilient? Because the first month in COVID, people were laid down and the government could not afford to support their citizens, just the first month. So are really our social welfare policies effective and appropriate and resilient? And the third one is about work insurance, ensuring having insurance for catastrophes and pandemics. Between, I don't know whether it can be a triple P, private-public partnerships, or what, but do we have enough insurance policies for work, especially in the private sector, where people can be cautioned against pandemics at least for 3 to 4 months? Not the first 2 months, already people are laid out and they are facing unemployment, and the informal sector, first 2 weeks, they are out and down and they are almost hungry. Our policies really, I think you get the gist of my question.
So quickly, in the interest of time, no, unfortunately, people were hoping that there is a distinct relation between cold weather and COVID-19. And somehow with summer approaching in kind of the northern hemisphere, COVID-19 would coronavirus would kind of disappear. Unfortunately, more and more research shows that there is no such strong relationship. It's still an ongoing research, but it doesn't look like that's likely to happen. One. Second, social welfare policies, are they effective, resilient? Entirely depends on which part of the world you are talking about. In some parts of Western Europe, especially Scandinavia, yes, they have very robust social welfare systems that have a long kind of history, and even then, people find them not good enough, but they're amongst the best in the planet. North America, US, terrible social welfare system, as many of you know. In parts of the developing world, no, social welfare system doesn't exist at all. It barely exists even on paper. Most parts of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, it is no question of resiliency, because the welfare system as a systematic kind of policy is highly kind of wanting. There may be a few countries that have better than others, but broad sweep, no, we need to do much, much better. The third is work insurance. Well, rather than kind of work insurance, most insurance, you don't insure against pandemics unless you make a very precise, you actually have the precise language in your kind of insurance. Otherwise, you don't. So most companies, even with very sound work-related insurance, were not insured against pandemics. There were a few notable exceptions, but most of them no. What now a lot of countries and a lot of people are now thinking about is UBI, is the whole idea of kind of giving basic income. And there are some countries, Finland tried it last year, 2017, for a short while. Now there are a lot more countries are now saying, look, we need to give dignity, respect for kind of people. And the idea to do that is to give UBI. In some cases, in some countries, it's called vital income. In some other, it's considered as kind of basic income. So there is a lot more, and this was part of also Bernie Sanders and kind of Elizabeth Warren's part of the platform for the U.S., where they were told, oh, they were kind of socialist. But now it's interesting because of COVID-19, there seems to be a lot more kind of interest around these issues. Okay, next one, please.
Okay, so we have 3 people that will do a question, and then that's it. So we'll sum them up, and that was it. So we have, let's begin please with Rachel, and then we have Roberta Croach, and we have then Maktar. Please quickly identify yourself. 1 question, please, and let's get going. Rachel.
Hi, thank you, Lucia. My name is Rachel from the University of Winnipeg. Thank you for the presentation. My question really is just to get your thoughts. 2 things are really coming out. There's been a lot of issues relating to gender, and how you also mentioned your presentation about patriarchy and how this is also affecting women in developing countries, and what strategies can we be thinking about? Because when we look at sustainable development goals, one of the key things we talk about is gender. How can we really start looking on intervention? And then, of course, indigenous knowledge. We had a recent webinar for African indigenous knowledge, where we are saying how can we start flowing back into the indigenous knowledge for us to be one of the survival ways of dealing post-COVID? So these are just my reflections, and what strategies or intervention points as MDP or would-be practitioners should be thinking through or should be lobbying for us to see that we continue to do the work that we have to, knowing that there's a lot at stake right now.
Okay, thank you. Roberta Croce.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Roberta?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the presentation again. I'm from University College Dublin, and my question is, seeing the situation that is so overwhelming from my point of view, and I guess for everyone, what can in our small life we do as practitioners? How can we face this situation, especially in our community? What can we do? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last one from Maktar. Maktar?
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the good presentations. So just a question, do you think that the consequence of the epidemic is just we need to break with policy in an area of health, urbanization, agriculture, and economic and financial also? For example, about health, I think the case is an opportunity to promote sustainable development in health. And about urbanization, why don't we think about all the scientific and technical progress must enable to use to display population in the rural world in order to relieve the congestion in the cities. We must be able, I think, to have an acceptable standard of living in the rural world. About agriculture, of course, because I think the health, we don't separate the health for all the activity of human being. Is a global problem. It's not just a specific problem in a health problem. It will be the approach. It will be a global problem. But our urbanization, our agriculture, for our agriculture, we need to means the increased global agriculture production while preserving natural resources and biodiversity. Also, we need to correct the imbalance between the very low production of underdeveloping country and the overproduction in developing country. I don't know what you think about these points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maktar. Very good. And the last one, Namdi, quickly, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Prof, for this very enlightening presentation. My question is, for us development practitioners, MDP students and alumni, what area of research in COVID-19, for those who would want to research more or write more about COVID-19, what area would you recommend that we go towards that will be of benefit to the people, to everyone? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. Wow.
Thank you very much.
Very good questions, and covers a lot of ground. Let me start with Rachel's really good question about kind of gender issues. I think one of the key things, and in fact, there are very nice kind of parallels to, in many ways, across most of your kind of questions, which is a key thing I would suggest, whether it is issues of gender, whether it is issues that we are kind of feeling overwhelmed, or how do we kind of break with the past through kind of reorganizing the economic geography of labor or health, or even the last question about what are the most promising areas of research. They really kind of point to the need to be much more kind of reflective on our own contexts of development. For example, kind of when you talk about patriarchy, what does it mean in the context of one's own research or work? Rather than adopt kind of universalizing definitions, which then there could be a failure to kind of make it really kind of contextual. Begin from kind of your own context. So to look at the realities of rural-urban dynamics, why in so many countries you have young women going to urban areas, dislocated from their families, and kind of what happens to them. Young men kind of dislocated because, again, as Mokhtar kind of very rightly talked about, this whole idea of kind of rethinking, the need to rethink the urban-rural dynamics. Again, I would challenge you, rather than talk about increasing agriculture production, what happens if you change it to enhancing food security? With that change of your kind of lens, it means that you also then begin to focus on access to food, access to nutrition. What is nutritious food? Who is growing? Now, there's a resurgence of interest in short supply chains because COVID-19 has revealed the vulnerability, the fragility of these kind of global supply chains, especially when it comes to agriculture and food. And this goes against the heart of economic orthodoxy. All the time we've been told about how there is competitive advantage. It's good for Costa Ricans of the world to grow whatever, bananas. They shouldn't be growing rice, right? But now it begs the question, what should be the nature of food security policies? And what should be the balance? Does it mean that we jettison all of our kind of economic orthodoxy? No, I'm not suggesting that. There are many good parts. But how do we kind of do this kind of new thinking, which I think you guys are really well placed, because as development practitioners, as students of development coming from developing countries or from developing situations in the global north, you have an access to the context that is so important. So don't ignore the context in your work or in your research. For me, that would be after 30 years of research and teaching, my takeaway for you would be pay heed to the context. Bring in your ideas, theoretically derived ideas, well fleshed out ideas, and reflect on the context to better understand the nature of structures, nature of institutions, why things are what they are. Don't get taken in by ideological arguments, right? You need to kind of unmask what's happening to then have a better idea of, okay, this is a really interesting area of research, or this kind of shows a glimmer of getting through patriarchy. For example, there is a really good article or report many of you may have read by Cronin Furman and colleagues at CUNY it's called Emissaries of Empowerment, how depoliticizing the women's movement in the global south basically led to technocratic implementation of projects, and how in the long run it has actually done a disservice to the very women that it was meant to improve, right? So it's very, very interesting because they look at the context, they take the context seriously. So you also should be kind of looking at the nature of the context and what then enables you to kind of have a very clear-eyed view of what is development for whom. A lot of these questions then are no longer theoretical, right? Development for whom, development how, because there are only so many ways you can be thinking about, right? So that would be my kind of collective answer to your fine questions. Lucia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Someshar, Shiv. What we're going to do, we appreciate your time. This could really go on forever and longer. Can I provide them with an email if they have additional questions, or should they come to me and I can send them to you? We can,
no, they can write to me.
Okay, so I'll let them have it. And for all the participants, thank you for showing up, for coming. Really appreciate it. And well, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, lots of research, lots of more reading, and trying to find our way in this world, which we, you know, it's definitely needed. There's a lot of work for us. There really is.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, stay safe, and I'll send you the email, and I'll have this video and presentation available probably by the end of today. So thank you so much. Thank you, Shiv, for taking the time
Lucia,
to be
and thank
with
you,
us.
guys. Do well, stay safe, and do well. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Mr. Matt, thank you.
Thank you.
Juanisa, nice to see you.
And Namdi,
Thank you.
thank you for organizing and getting everybody ready.
Thank you very much, man. Udita, thank you.
Thank you at all. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Biola,
Nabil.
thank you for coming. Mr. Mark, I see you. Thank you.
Okay, so Namdi, I'll give you the email for
Yeah.
Shiv, and
All right.
then when you're in your twit, you can send it out to them, and then I'll see, I'll get his a presentation, and then I'll make it available. I did record it. I need to really find a place on our website where we can just make this available.
Yeah, we can create a link for at global SAC link, and have a link where we'll put all the videos and the presentations. So it is easy for students who didn't make it to the presentation to go to the website and get the resources.
Exactly, that would be good. So this was good. Okay.
Very good. Thank you very much, man. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.